The email that ended Dr. Cordelia Ashworth's career arrived at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning, and by lunchtime, 200 of her colleagues had read it before she did. It had been sent, accidentally, the apology later claimed, to the entire staff list of the Thornfield Botanical Institute instead of to its board, and it was written by the Institute's director, Professor Hugh Calloway, a man who gave television interviews in a wax jacket among the rose beds and had not personally run an experiment since 1998. The subject line read R.E. Ashworth funding decision, confidential, and the body of it recommended, in the fluent, regretful language of a man performing reluctance, that Dr. Ashworth's research program be terminated and her fellowship withdrawn, in light of irregularities in her orchid propagation data which, while perhaps not rising to formal misconduct, suggest a pattern of results too convenient to be credible. Too convenient to be credible. Cordelia read the sentence 11 times, standing in the glasshouse corridor with her phone in one hand and a seedling tray balanced on the other, while around her the Institute staff developed a sudden, collective fascination with the middle distance. Her results were not convenient. Her results were the product of 9 years of work on cool climate propagation of Cypripedium hybrids, 9 years of 4 a.m. starts and Christmas days spent adjusting misting schedules, and they were reproducible. And she could prove they were reproducible, and none of that mattered, because the question had been asked in public, and the asking was the sentence. Science, like every other world she would come to know that year, ran on reputation, and reputation was a glass house. Years to grow something in it, 1 stone to end it. What she did not know that Tuesday, what she would not understand for months, was why. Why a director who had ignored her for a decade had suddenly found her data too convenient. Why the termination letter, when it formally arrived, included a clause requiring her to surrender all cultivation records, site notebooks, and any materials relating to off-site propagation locations. Why, 3 days after she cleared her bench, a man from a firm called Marchant Land Strategies telephoned to ask charmingly whether she might know the current ownership status of a derelict Victorian glasshouse structure on the edge of the village of Elmsley in Kent. She knew the structure. Everyone in her family knew the structure. It belonged to her grandmother, and her grandmother, Margit Ashworth, born Margit Eisler, in a city she had refused for 80 years to name, had died the previous month at the age of 98, holding Cordelia's hand, with the last of the winter light coming through the ward window, and her final words had not been in English. Cordelia had assumed they were a prayer, they were an address. The funeral had already happened. The will reading happened the week after the sacking, in a solicitor's office in Canterbury, and it was there that the second public humiliation of Cordelia's spring was staged, because it was staged. She understood that later, too. Her Aunt Verity had brought her own solicitor. Verity Ashworth Bell, Margit's daughter-in-law by Cordelia's late uncle, chair of 3 charity committees, a woman upholstered in cream wool who had spent 40 years being disappointed by other people's manners, had also brought her son, Cordelia's cousin Rupert, who ran a boutique property fund and wore his signet ring like an argument. Margit's estate was small and tidy. The cottage in Elmsley went to Verity's side. As expected, it had come originally from the Ashworth grandfather. The savings were divided, and then Mr. Ockhaffer, the solicitor, read the clause that made Rupert laugh out loud. To my granddaughter Cordelia, who has patience with living things, I leave the old greenhouse and the walled acre it stands upon, together with everything it holds, roots and all. She is not to sell it for 5 years. She will understand when she is ready and not before. Roots and all, Rupert repeated, delighted. Delia, you've inherited a ruin and a legally binding gardening metaphor. It's actually a liability, not a bequest, Verity said, to her solicitor rather than to anyone related to her. That structure is condemned, or should be. There's a duty of care question if trespassers are injured. Honestly, the kindest reading is that Margit was further gone than we admitted. She turned to Cordelia with the particular smile she had been aiming at her for 30 years, the one that expressed sympathy the way a knife expresses friendship. Darling, you've just lost your position. You can hardly maintain a folly in Kent. Rupert's fund would take it off your hands as part of the cottage parcel. He'd be generous, wouldn't you, Rupert? 15,000, said Rupert generously. There's a covenant, Cordelia said, 5 years. Covenants, said Verity's solicitor, speaking for the first time, can be interpreted. So can grandmothers, said Cordelia, and signed for her key. It wasn't a key, in fact. It was a key ring holding one Victorian latch key, one small modern brass key that fitted nothing anyone could identify, and a third object that Mr. Acaffer handed over separately, in an envelope with her name on it in Margit's arthritic copperplate. A brass plant label, the old kind, the kind you wrote on with a stylus, and on it in her grandmother's hand, a single Latin name, Cypripedium calceolus. The lady's slipper orchid, the rarest native orchid in Britain, and not coincidentally the subject of Cordelia's terminated research, the plant her grandmother had first shown her a photograph of when she was 6 years old, saying in her accent that 5 decades of Kent had never softened. This one, Delia. If you learn to keep this one alive, you can keep anything alive. It hides for years underground and everyone says it is dead. It is not dead. It is deciding. Cordelia drove to Elmsley that evening through lanes frothing with cow parsley, and stood at the gate of the walled acre as the light went, looking at her inheritance. The greenhouse rose out of the nettles like the skeleton of a whale, a great Victorian span of rusted ironwork and green-furred glass, 60 feet long, its ridge crested with broken finials, one whole bay's panes gone white with lichen. It had been built, village history said, in the 1870s by a plant-hunting rector, and it had been derelict as long as anyone could remember. As long as anyone could remember. Cordelia stood at the gate with the latch key cold in her hand, and interrogated that phrase for the first time in her life, because she was a scientist, and the datum did not fit. Her grandmother, the most fiercely practical woman she had ever known, a woman who darned socks and rewired her own lamps and grew a year of vegetables on a quarter acre, had owned this structure for 70 years and let it rot. Except that the wall around the acre was sound. Cordelia walked it in the last of the light, and the wall, 9 feet of Victorian brick, had been repointed within the last decade, discreetly, the mortar color matched. The gate hinges were rusted picturesque orange but turned without a sound. Oiled steel sleeves sat inside the rust. And the nettles and brambles that made the acre look abandoned grew in a pattern her professional eye undid within minutes. They had been managed into wildness, cut and laid like a hedge, densest along the sight lines from the lane and the cottage, thinner where they didn't show. It was the most sophisticated piece of camouflage gardening she had ever seen, and it had been maintained by a woman in her 90s, and it had fooled everyone for 70 years, including the granddaughter who did it for a living. It hides for years, and everyone says it is dead. It is not dead, it is deciding. Inside the greenhouse was a ruin, and the ruin was another lie. It took her 3 visits to see it, 3 days of clearing, sweeping, cataloging broken pots and rotted staging, because the misdirection was flawless, layers of genuine dereliction arranged over the tell like topsoil. But on the 3rd evening, working along the back wall where the old vine border ran, she found the anomaly her trade had trained her to find. The soil was wrong. The vine border, a raised bed of black earth running the length of the north wall, was dry, not summer dry, roof dry. 70 years of Kentish rain had come through 100 broken panes and soaked every inch of that greenhouse floor to a rich, weedy loam, except this bed, where the weeds were sparse and shallow-rooted, and the earth 2 feet down was as dry as flour, which was only possible if something impermeable lay beneath it. She excavated like the fieldworker she was, in gridded sections, photographing each stage without yet knowing why her hands insisted on evidence protocol. 18 inches down, Her trowel rang on iron. It was a door, set flat into a brick surround like a cellar drop, painted with bitumen, its hinges packed with grease that was still soft, still maintained, and its hasp secured by a small, bright, modern brass padlock that matched the small, bright, modern brass key on her grandmother's ring. Cordelia sat back on her heels in the ruined greenhouse in the green dusk, with her heart going like a struck bird, and because she was her grandmother's granddaughter, did not open it. Instead, she went back to her car, fetched the work lamp, the head torch, the camera, and her field notebook, and wrote the date and time and light conditions on a fresh page. Then she opened it. Brick steps went down into darkness that smelled of dust and machine oil and something underneath both, something dry and mineral and old. At the bottom, her lamp found a room perhaps 12 feet square, walls whitewashed, ceiling vaulted in engineering brick Victorian work, the rector's forgotten root cellar or fruit store, but repurposed by different hands, because along one wall ran a workbench that had nothing to do with gardening. It was a jeweler's bench. She knew it only from films, the half-moon cutout, the leather catch-skin slung beneath, the ranks of tiny tools racked with a precision that made her throat ache because she knew the housekeeping. It was her grandmother's kitchen drawer, her grandmother's sewing box, that same fierce order. There was a cast-iron wheel of some kind on its own stand, belt-driven, its spindle furred with dust but its bearings gleaming. There were loops in a rack, graded by power. There were notebooks, a shelf of them, black cloth bindings, decades of them. And in the corner stood a green-painted safe the size of a night storage heater, a pre-war Chubb, its door not locked but simply closed, as though its owner had known that by the time anyone stood here, the lock would have done its 70 years of work and could rest. Cordelia opened it. The safe held 3 things, arranged, she would think later, for exactly this moment, by a woman who had rehearsed her death with the same care she gave her tomatoes. The first was a folded square of chamois leather, and inside it a canvas roll, and inside that, sewn into individual pockets like surgical instruments, were diamonds. Cordelia was a botanist. She had never held a diamond larger than the chip in her mother's engagement ring, but she did not need to be a gemologist to understand that the stones lying across her palm in the lamplight, 26 of them, cold and heavier than they had any right to be, throwing the beam of her head torch around the whitewashed vault like a glass house full of stars, were not something a village widow ought to have had under her vine border. Most were the size of peas. 2 were the size of hazelnuts. 1, wrapped separately in tissue that had been renewed recently enough to still be white, was the size of a damson, cut in an old, deep, symmetrical style even her ignorance could tell was from another century, and it was the pale, unmistakable blue of a February sky. The second thing was a stack of documents in a biscuit tin, papers in German and Dutch and French, stamped and counterstamped. A British enemy alien registration card from 1940 in the name of Eisler, Margit B. 1928, Antwerpen. Photographs, a bearded man in shirt sleeves at a bench exactly like the one behind her, a shopfront with a name painted in gold, Eisler and Zonen, Diamantslijpraj, a family on a step, and a girl of 11 or 12 with Cordelia's own jaw and her grandmother's unmistakable, level, deciding eyes. And the third was a letter. Of course it was a letter. It was addressed to Delia when the greenhouse lets you in, and it ran to 9 pages, and Cordelia read it sitting on the bottom step of the hidden room with the diamonds in her lap, and the tears coming steadily and without drama down her face, because that was how her grandmother would have wanted crying done, if it had to be done at all. My Delia, I was born Margit Eisler in Antwerp. My father, Samuel, was a master cleaver. You do not know the word yet. You will. In May 1940, he sewed the best of our stones into my coat and my mother's and put us on a boat at Ostend, and he stayed for my grandfather, who could not travel, and I never saw either of them again. You have wondered all your life why I would not speak of before the war. This is why, It was not grief or not only. It was a debt I could not collect and would not forget, and speaking spends things, Delia. Silence saves them. We were to be met in London by my father's partner, his English partner, the man who sold our stones there, whom my father trusted as a brother, whose name you will find in these papers often, and whose name you already know because all of England knows it. It is over a door on Bond Street with royal warrants beside it. He met the boat. He took my mother's coat and mine for safekeeping. He gave my mother a receipt and paperwork and promises. And then my mother died in the influenza of that first winter, and when I, a girl of 13, alone, an enemy alien with a card and an accent, came to the shining door on Bond Street to ask for my father's stones, the receipt was examined, and I was told it referred to a consignment sold on Mr. Eisler's instruction to fund his family's passage, and I was given £9 and shown the pavement. 26 stones went in those coats, Delia, and one of them was the Vrouw van Antwerpen, the blue. My great-grandfather cut it. There is not another like it in the world, except that on Bond Street, in a house that keeps royal warrants, there sits behind glass a famous blue diamond of almost its weight, with a history written for it that begins, conveniently, in 1946. Almost its weight. Remember that. A cleaver's daughter remembers everything, and I have written it all in the black books. Every stone, every measurement my father taught me, every mark of his wheel, because a cutter's hand signs its work, Delia, as surely as ink. And I have spent 70 years with these hands in this room, making sure I could prove it, in the only way their kind of people cannot argue with. I could not fight them. A refugee girl against a royal warrant, I saw what happened to the two who tried. You will find those stories in the tin as well, and they are not kind. So I married your grandfather, who was gentle and asked no questions, and I grew vegetables, and I let them believe the Eislers were finished. But I kept the 26 they never got. Yes, Delia, the coats they took were the second-best stones. My father trusted no one completely, not even his brother of 30 years, and he was right. And I kept the skills, and I kept the proofs, and I kept this room, and now I am giving all of it to the one person I have ever met with the patience of a cleaver. They have never stopped looking, by the way. When land agents come sniffing at Elmsley, when charming men ask about old glass houses, and they have, every decade of my life, that is not coincidence. The house on Bond Street keeps its own black books, and it knows what was in the receipt it dishonored, and a firm that has built a crown on a stolen stone can never stop guarding the lie. Lately they have grown busy again. There is to be a great exhibition, I read, for their 200th year, the blue to be the centerpiece, loaned to a museum, insured for a number with many zeros. Insurance, Delia, requires certainty. Certainty requires that no Eisler ever surfaces. If you are reading this and strange things have begun to happen in your life, look behind them. Be slow, be dull, be underestimated. It is the best soil there is. And when you are ready, the greenhouse has one more thing to show you, but you will find it yourself, because you are the only one I ever taught to look at what a plant is telling you. It hides for years, it is not dead, it is deciding. All my love, all my stones, and all my patience. Oh my... Cordelia sat for a long time after the 9th page, in the mineral-smelling dark, while the lamp hummed and the 26 stars lay cold in her lap, and she did the thing her training did with every flood of data. She sorted it. A house on Bond Street with royal warrants and a bicentenary exhibition. She knew the name without opening the tin. There was only one. Castellan and Vane, jewelers to 3 coronations, a brand worth more than some countries. Currently, the business pages said, preparing a flotation on the stock exchange. Its crown jewel bicentenary exhibition at a national museum, this autumn to be the beating heart of the prospectus. The Castellan blue, insured, she looked it up, sitting on the cellar steps, phone held to the sky at the top of the stairs for signal, for £60 million. Provenance. Acquired from a continental estate, 1946. A refugee's receipt, dishonored in 1940. a blue diamond of almost the right weight, because, she understood with a jolt of pure cold, you would recut a stolen stone, wouldn't you? You would shave the Vrouw van Antwerpen into a new identity, and a cleaver's daughter with her father's measurements could prove exactly what had been shaved and how. A director who suddenly found her data too convenient 3 weeks after Castellan and Vane's flotation was announced. A termination letter demanding her off-site propagation records. A land agency asking about a derelict glasshouse. Her aunt's solicitor, remarkably well briefed, calling covenants interpretable. Rupert's boutique property fund, and she would check this within the week and be right, with a new institutional investor whose paperwork led, through 2 shell companies, to the private office of the chairman of Castellan and Vane. They hadn't ended her career because of orchids. They had ended it to make her poor, and they wanted her poor so she would sell an acre in Kent, and they wanted the acre because somewhere in a boardroom above Bond Street, a 200-year-old house preparing to sell shares in its own myth had run the last audit of its oldest lie and found one loose thread still alive. The Eisler girl, 98, and her strange, stubborn, 70-year attachment to a worthless ruin of glass. They had waited for her grandmother to die. They had moved within the month. Cordelia Ashworth, unemployed, unfunded, publicly discredited, owner of one condemned greenhouse, wrapped the stones, closed the safe, climbed the brick steps into the ordinary Kentish night, and locked the iron door beneath its 18 inches of deciding earth. Then she stood in the ruin among the nettles her grandmother had trained into a lie, looked up through the broken panes at the first stars, and spoke aloud for the first time in 3 days, to the acre, to the vault, to the level-eyed girl from Antwerp. "Right, Oma," she said. "Let's see what the greenhouse wants to show me." Somewhere down the lane, unhurried, a car she did not recognize completed its 3rd slow pass of the evening, and its lights swept the wall and moved on. The car came back the next morning, and this time it stopped. Cordelia was on the greenhouse roof, or rather on the ladder against it, photographing the glazing bars for a structural survey she had commissioned, partly because the building needed one and partly because a paper trail of legitimate restoration was the most boring possible explanation for a woman spending every daylight hour inside a ruin. When she heard the gate latch lift, the oiled hinges made no sound, which was how she knew her visitor had opened it confidently, without knocking, the way people open gates they expect to own. He was 40ish, weatherproofed in the expensive way, all soft shell and suede boots, and he came up the path reading the greenhouse through small rimless glasses as though it were a balance sheet. Behind him, at the gate, waited a younger woman with a tablet. "Miss Ashworth, Giles Marchant, Marchant Land Strategies. We spoke, well, we didn't, you didn't return my call, entirely understandable, difficult time." His smile was excellent. Everything about him was excellent and rented. "I'll be brief because I can see you're busy. I represent a client assembling a small portfolio of heritage horticultural structures, restoration, community use, that sort of thing. Your greenhouse came up in our survey work. It's a liability for you as it stands. I gather there's a covenant preventing sale, but covenants restrain sales, not leases, and my client would take a 99-year lease at a figure that would, frankly, change your circumstances." Which, the smile softened into sympathy, beautifully weighted, "I understand have changed already, through no fault of your own. The Thornfield business was shabby. Everyone says so. Everyone says so." 4 words to tell her that he knew about Thornfield, that he knew she should be desperate, and that he expected desperation to do the negotiating for him. "What figure?" said Cordelia, because desperate women ask that question, and she had decided on the latter before he reached the path's halfway point, exactly which woman she was going to be for this man, the one her aunt had described in the solicitor's office. Overwhelmed, recently humiliated, fond of plants. £400,000 for a 99-year lease on a condemned structure in a nettle field. In the silence, a blackbird took the top of the wall and sang about territory. "That's gosh," said Cordelia, botanist, and let the word hang there doing its work. "That's a lot to think about. Can I think about it?" Of course. He produced a card with the speed of a conjurer. "Only my client's program is time-sensitive, funding cycles. Shall we say a fortnight?" At the gate he paused, exactly as another visitor had paused in another doorway in a story Cordelia did not yet know was rhyming, and looked back down the length of the great glass skeleton. "Wonderful old bones," he said. "Original vine border along the north wall, I'd imagine. They tell me those old borders can run surprisingly deep." He held her eye for precisely 1 beat too long, and left. Cordelia stood on the ladder until the car had gone, then climbed down, sat on an upturned pot among the nettles, and let her hands shake for exactly 2 minutes, which was the ration she had decided to allow them each day. They tell me those old borders can run deep. They knew, then, or suspected hard enough that the difference no longer mattered. Not what, perhaps, but where. 70 years of her grandmother's silence had narrowed their search to 1 acre, and her grandmother's death had started a clock, and the flotation, she'd read the coverage properly now, in the library in Canterbury, on a public terminal, logged into nothing. The flotation had given the clock a face. Castellan and Vane would list on the London Stock Exchange in November. The bicentenary exhibition opened at the museum in October. 200 years of light, the Castellan blue as its heart, the prospectus already trading on it, the chairman, Sir Denholm Vane, 73, silver as sterling, photographed touching the case with white gloves, quoted everywhere. "A house is only as good as its history." £400,000 to buy the acre where the history was buried. It was, Cordelia had to concede, cheap at the price. She gave her hands their 2 minutes. Then she went to find what the greenhouse wanted to show her, because her grandmother had promised one more thing, and Giles Marchant's fortnight had just made finding it urgent. "You will find it yourself, because you are the only one I ever taught to look at what a plant is telling you." She had been looking for 3 days already, and the acre had told her plenty, the laid brambles, the sightline planting, but nothing that felt like a message rather than a defense. So that afternoon she stopped looking like a granddaughter and started looking like what she was, the thing Thornfield had thrown away. A field botanist with 9 years of orchid work, standing in 1 walled acre of undisturbed, deliberately managed ground. She gritted it. She walked it in transects, north-south then east-west, recording species as though the nettle field were a study site, and the acre came apart under method the way everything did. Most of it was exactly what it pretended: bramble, nettle, dock, the honest thugs of neglect. But along the greenhouse's south face, in the strip of ground that would once have been the display border, the sward was different: fine grasses, low herbs, the specific, unmistakable community of soil kept poor on purpose, mown once a year for decades by someone who knew that rich soil drowns delicate things and poor soil protects them. Meadow botany, maintained in secret, disguised inside dereliction. And in that strip in the third transect, her eye caught the leaves she had spent 9 years learning, broad, pleated, paired, out of season for flower, unmistakable in structure. Cypripedium calceolus, the lady's slipper orchid. Extinct in the wild in England but for one guarded site in Yorkshire, and here was a colony of, she counted on her knees, hardly breathing, 41 plants in Kent in her acre, thriving. It was impossible. It was also, she realized over the next 2 hours, flat on her stomach with her hand lens, not the message. It was the medium. Because the colony was planted in rows. Not natural drift rows, and the rows were groups, and the groups were spaced with a regularity that made her think first of vineyards and then, with the vertigo of it arriving all at once, of lines of text. Her grandmother had taught her to read what a plant was telling you. Her grandmother had also, the biscuit tin said, spent 1943 to 1945 as a fire watcher and volunteer telegraphist. Cordelia fetched her notebook and mapped the colony plant by plant, and by dusk she had it, clusters of 1 to 5 plants, gaps of 2 lengths between clusters, gaps of 5 between groups. Morse. Slow-growing, self-renewing, 70-year morse, written in the rarest plant in Britain by a woman who had calculated, correctly, that the one person who would ever both notice the orchids and think to count them was the granddaughter she had trained from the age of 6, and that no property developer, no hired searcher, no man in suede boots would ever see anything but weeds. The message was 14 letters and 2 numbers. It read, SDBOTOLPH Crypt 1946 II. St. Botolph's was the village church, Norman Flint, where Margit Eisler had married gentle Arthur Ashworth in Cordelia checked the tin, 1946. The crypt was closed to the public. And she would discover 2 days later, standing in the cold under the church with the rector's lamp and the parish's oldest verger, after a performance of grief-stricken family piety that was 2/3 genuine, was the second bay of the Ashworth family vault, where a lead-lined deed box, logged in the parish register in 1946 as deposited by Mrs. M. Ashworth, personal papers, not to be released except to blood descent, had been waiting for 80 years. The box was the archive the safe had only summarized. The safe held proofs, the box held the case. Her grandfather Samuel Eisler's actual workbooks, brought out in the coats, his stone-by-stone registers in a cramped Flemish hand, and for the great blue, 6 full pages, crown angles, girdle thickness, the map of a cleaver's mind, with tissue overlays traced from the stone itself. The 1940 receipt, the original, signed in a confident English hand, received of Mrs. R. Eisler, 26 stones per schedule annexed, held to order E. Castellan Vane. The schedule annexed. Letters between the partners going back to 1921, warm, brotherly, damning in retrospect. And a second, thinner file in Margit's own hand, compiled across decades, labeled in Flemish. The ones who tried. 2 names. A Rotterdam dealer, 1949, who had raised the resemblance between a vanished Antwerp stone and the new Castellan blue, and had been sued into silence and bankruptcy by 1951. And a young English journalist, 1968, who had gotten as far as requesting the 1946 import records, and whose paper had dropped the story after the file contained the clipping. His arrest on charges, later quietly dismissed, of receiving stolen goods that had been found with wonderful convenience in the boot of his car. I saw what happened to the 2 who tried. Cordelia read both files twice, sitting on a stone shelf beside her ancestors, and understood that her grandmother had not been paranoid and had not been patient the way saints are patient. She had been patient the way artillery is patient. She had spent 70 years assembling a firing solution and had died waiting for one thing she could not manufacture, a moment when the house on Bond Street would be too publicly exposed to do what it had done in 1951 and 1968, a moment when it would stake everything on scrutiny, when it would invite the world to look. 200 years of light, opening October, flotation November. Oma, Cordelia thought, you didn't leave me a treasure. You left me a loaded gun and a date. She was halfway up the crypt stairs, deed box in her arms, when her phone found signal and shook with 3 days of messages. And the top one was from her cousin Rupert, and reading it in the church porch, she felt the fortnight snap shut like a trap 2 days early. Delia heads up as family. Mum's solicitor has found a structural engineer's report saying the greenhouse is dangerous, plus on that basis council can serve a S77 notice, demolition or make safe, owner's cost, £120,000 120K. Obviously you can't cover that. Marchant's client would still lease at the full figure this week only and would handle all the council stuff. After that his offer drops to 40K and you're left with the notice. Genuinely trying to help you here. RX. Genuinely trying to help. Cordelia stood in the porch of the church where her grandmother had buried the truth under the altar of the family that was now selling her, and did the arithmetic of the squeeze. A manufactured dangerous structure notice she couldn't pay, a covenant that blocked selling but not seizure, a lease offer engineered to look like rescue. And she had no doubt at all excavators through the vine border within a month of signature, ground stabilization works, and 18 inches of deciding earth giving up its iron door to men who would log nothing, report nothing, and make one small vault of family history simply never have existed. They thought money was pressure. They had ended her career to make money pressure. And standing there, Cordelia felt the last of Thornfield's shame burn off like morning fog, because her grandmother's letter had told her what pressure actually was and what to do inside it. Be slow, be dull, be underestimated. It is the best soil there is. She typed, "Rupert, this is scary. I don't have that kind of money. Can Marchant's people give me till Monday? I just need the weekend to get my head round it. DX." The reply came in 4 minutes, and she could hear the relief in it, the shared glance in some office, the she's folding, of course. "Monday, you're doing the right thing. RX. 5 days. Cordelia drove home the long way, watching her mirrors now, the deed box belted into the passenger seat like a child. And by the time she reached her rented cottage, she had the list in her head that she wrote out that night and pinned above the kettle, because her grandmother worked from lists, and so did she. 1. The Stones and both archives out of Kent, tonight, somewhere with vaults and receipts, which meant Hatton Garden, and Hatton Garden meant the name from the biscuit tin she had not yet pulled, the London Diamond Bourse arbitrator, long retired now, who appeared in Margit's papers across 40 years of tiny, careful transactions, the one man in England her grandmother had trusted with cut stones and no questions. N. Levinsky, Greville Street. If he was alive, he was 90. Her grandmother would have considered that no obstacle whatever. 2. The council report. Engineers' reports had authors, and authors had professional bodies, and a report commissioned to a predetermined conclusion left fingerprints. Boring people with matching dates, she had learned that lesson from her own survey work, from 9 years of reviewers trying to break her data. Let them teach her to be broken. She knew the syllabus. 3 October, the exhibition. The one stage they had built themselves, insured for 60 million, wired to a stock market listing, where the Castellan Blue would sit in public glass under museum lighting for the first time in its stolen life. Measurable, photographable, comparable. While every financial journalist in London stood around it taking the prospectus's word for the history. A house is only as good as its history, Sir Denholm Vane kept saying. Yes, said Cordelia Ashworth, alone in her kitchen, to the list, to the deed box, to the level-eyed girl from Antwerp who had waited 86 years for a granddaughter with the patience of a cleaver. It is. She put the kettle on and began. Greville Street at 8 in the morning smelled of coffee and diesel, and the doorway Cordelia wanted was so narrow she walked past it twice. A slot between a bureau de change and a shuttered kosher bakery, one bell among 6, its brass plate worn to a whisper, NLEVINSKY and Son, valuations by appointment. She had not made an appointment. Her grandmother's papers suggested that appointments were not how this door worked. She pressed the bell, looked up into the camera she was meant to see, and held against the lens without a word, the brass plant label with Cypripedium calceolus written on it in Margit's hand, because the tin's oldest letter from Levinsky, dated 1958, ended. Should you ever send anyone in your place, Margit, send them with something only you would send. The buzzer went before her arm was down. 3 floors up, past landings stacked with 50 years of dead safes, she found the room, small, hot, netted with wire at the window and inhabited by 2 men. The younger, 60 perhaps, waistcoated where he stood. The elder did not, because the elder was in a wheelchair by the workbench, a rug over his knees and a loop on a cord round his neck, and he was studying the plant label in the screen's frozen image with an expression Cordelia would try and fail to describe for the rest of her life. 96 years old, Nathan Levinsky. His hands were spotted and translucent and absolutely still. "She's dead then," he said. Not a question. His accent was Clerkenwell laid over something older, the way her grandmother's Kent had been laid over Antwerp. Margit Eisler is dead and she has sent me a flower." He looked up and his eyes were wet and entirely ferociously alert. "And you are the granddaughter, the plant doctor. Sit down, plant doctor. Daniel the good chairs, and lock the street door, we are closed." It took the whole morning, and it was not a briefing. It was a reunion conducted across a grave. Nathan Levinsky had known her grandmother for 67 years. He had been a boy in the Bourse when the Rotterdam dealer was destroyed in 1951, and had watched it happen. They did not sue him for lying, girl. They sued him because he wasn't. And it was to Levinsky's bench, once a decade under valuation cover, that Margit had brought a stone or two from the 26, to be discreetly sold when the cottage needed a roof or a granddaughter needed a university. It was Levinsky who had kept the Vrouw van Antwerpen's legend alive in the one place that never forgot anything, the trade's own memory, where old men over herring sandwiches still said the Castellan blue. Ask the Eislers, and it was Levinsky, it turned out, who had renewed the tissue paper. Every few years she came, we opened the roll, we checked the stones like you check on children sleeping. The last time he stopped, and his son Daniel quietly poured tea, and he started again. "The last time, 18 months ago, she said to me, 'Nathan, the next hands that unwrap these will be Delia's. Tell her the stones are the least of it. Tell her the books are the case. And tell her,' the old man leaned forward and the loop swung out on its cord like a plumb line finding true, "that the wheel signs its work. You understand this. You have the books." "I have everything. It's in the car." In the car, Daniel Levinsky was on the stairs before the sentence finished. By noon, everything was off the street. The 26 stones went into the Levinsky vault under bonded receipt, witnessed, photographed, inventoried against Samuel Eisler's 1940 schedule. And Cordelia watched 2 professional lifetimes bend over that reconciliation, stone to line to stone, 26 ticks, and watched Daniel Levinsky, a valuer of 40 years standing, have to leave the room briefly when the damson-sized blue came out of its tissue and lay on the white pad throwing its cold February light. And his father said to it, softly, in Yiddish, something Cordelia did not ask to have translated. The workbooks were scanned page by page to 3 encrypted drives before the originals went into the safe deposit, because Levinsky's, it emerged, believed in chain of custody the way rectors believed in God. And over herring sandwiches at the bench, Nathan Levinsky gave her the education her war chest needed, the thing her grandmother's letter had called the only proof their kind of people cannot argue with. "Paper they will fight," he said. "Receipts forged, they will say. Letters misread. Provenance is stories, girl, and stories can be bought. They have been buying theirs for 80 years and it has warrants on it. But," he raised one finger and even the dust seemed to hold still, "a cut stone is not a story. A cleaver's hand is like a fist on a page, the angles he favors, how he turns a facet junction, the tremble he does not know he has. Your great-great-grandfather cut the Vrouw in 1908 on a wheel this family still owns. It is in your cellar in Kent. I have oiled it myself. Samuel's book gives every measurement of the finished stone, to tolerances I could not hold today with lasers. Now, to make the Vrouw into the Castellan blue, someone in 1945 or 46 recut her. Lightly, she lost less than 2 carats. They were greedy even in fear. But a recut is a conversation between 2 hands, the first cutters and the second cutter worked fast and frightened. And here is what Vane's people have never understood, because they are sellers, not makers. Modern scanning, the tomography, the same physics as your hospital, Daniel will explain. He has the machines through the Bourse. Modern scanning reads internal features. Growth structure. Old facet planes ghosted under new ones, strain patterns from the original cleaving. The Vrouw's internal map is in Samuel's book with his tracings. If the museum stones insides match that map, no expert on this earth can stand in a witness box and say otherwise, and every expert on this earth will be watching, because you will do it. In October, Cordelia said, in public at their exhibition. The old man sat back, and for the first time that day he smiled, and Cordelia saw suddenly and completely the young man who had watched injustice done in 1951 and had spent 70 years keeping a legend warm in case a day like this ever came. "Margit's granddaughter," he said to his son as if presenting her. "You see, the patience of a cleaver. Now who is your lawyer? Because between here and October, girl, they are going to come at you with everything soft first and everything hard after, and the soft is more dangerous." The soft arrived on Monday, as scheduled. She had spent the weekend on the engineer's report, item 2 on the kettle list, and it had come apart faster than she dared hope, because arrogance leaves fingerprints, and this had been done arrogantly. The independent structural assessment Verity's solicitor had lodged with the council was authored by a consultancy called Penrose Blake. Penrose Blake's parent, 2 filings up at Company's House, was an outfit named Guildhouse Advisory, and Guildhouse Advisory's registered clients disclosed in a regulatory filing connected to, of all things, the flotation, included Castellan and Vane Holdings plc. Better, the report's author had never visited the site. Cordelia could prove it because her camera trap, a wildlife camera standard field kit, strapped in an ivied elm and logging every visitor to the acre since the day after Giles Marchant's visit, had recorded no engineer, no ladder, no survey, nothing but foxes, 1 badger, and at 2:40 a.m. on Thursday night, 2 men in dark clothing spending 90 minutes at the north border with a metal detector before leaving empty-handed and unhurried through the gate they had picked open. She had watched that clip many times, cold to the fingertips, and then she had made herself watch it as her grandmother would have, as intelligence. They had detected the iron door they must have. They had not dug, which meant the digging was planned for after the lease, lawful and leisurely, behind hoardings marked ground stabilization. They still believed they were early. Good. Early people are careless people. So on Monday morning, when the conference call convened, Rupert, oily with kindness, Verity's solicitor, Giles Marchant representing the client's program, and a council enforcement officer whom Marchant had helpfully invited, Cordelia let them talk. She let Marchant regretfully confirm the offer's expiry, let the solicitor walk through the Section 77 notice, let Rupert do his genuinely trying to help you here, Delia, and she said, at intervals in her overwhelmed botanist voice, "I see, and gosh, and this is all quite a lot." And then, when they had finished building the trap and stood back to watch her enter it, she read out slowly, dully, like a woman reading an aspirin label, 4 sentences she and a construction litigation solicitor found by Daniel Levinsky had spent Sunday polishing. That the Penrose Blake report had been prepared without any site visit, as time-stamped camera evidence held by her solicitors demonstrated, and was therefore not merely negligent but arguably fraudulent. That Penrose Blake's ultimate beneficial ownership connected to a party with a live commercial interest in the land, a conflict undisclosed to the council, which her solicitors would be raising with the relevant professional body and with the council's own monitoring officer by close of business. That her own commissioned survey, a real one, by a real engineer with photographs, found the structure stable and was already lodged. And that any further communication regarding the property should be directed to her solicitors, Harewood Kaplan of Gray's Inn, who were instructed and funded. The silence on the line lasted 11 seconds. Cordelia counted them the way her grandmother had counted plants. "Funded," repeated Verity's solicitor at last, and in that one word Cordelia heard the entire machine change gear, heard the file being relabeled from distressed seller to problem, and heard, underneath, the first faint note of the question that was the whole point of Phase 5, the question she needed them to start asking and to keep asking all the way to October. Who is she really, and what does she have? "Funded," Cordelia agreed pleasantly and hung up, and stood in her kitchen listening to her heart, thinking, now the hard. The hard took 9 days to arrive, and it came in the order Nathan had predicted over the herring sandwiches, almost admiringly. First they kill the reputation again, to poison any future witness box. Then they come to see the grave for themselves. The reputation first. On Wednesday week, a trade press website ran a piece. Questions resurface over sacked botanist's data, recycling the Thornfield allegations with fresh, anonymous, lovingly specific quotes, and it would have been unbearable except for two things. The first was that Cordelia now knew exactly what the piece was for, and a smear you can classify as a smear half spent. The second was that the article overreached. It quoted a source close to the Institute describing irregularities in her off-site cultivation records, a phrase that existed nowhere in the public record, nowhere in the Thornfield proceedings, only in her private termination letter. Somebody had shown a journalist a confidential document, and Harewood Kaplan wrote 2 letters before lunch, one to the website and one to Thornfield's board, and by Friday Professor Hugh Calloway was suspended pending a data protection investigation, and the first brick in the wall between Castellan and Vane and their deniability had been quietly dislodged. Boring people. Matching dates. And then on the 9th night, the grave. She was in London when it happened, by design. She had been ostentatiously in London a great deal, letting the acre look unwatched, and the camera trap and its new brothers caught all of it in grainy infrared. 4 men this time, a van in the lane, screens erected over the vine border, and 3 hours of fast, professional digging. The iron door surfacing under their lamps like a wreck, bolt cutters through the padlock. 2 men descending with lights, and she never tired of this frame. She had it printed later, and kept it in a drawer the way other people keep photographs of weddings. The 2 of them emerging, 20 minutes on, to stand in visible gesticulating disbelief in the pit. Because the room beneath the greenhouse held a jeweler's bench, a belt-driven wheel bolted to its stand and too heavy to lift, an empty pre-war safe standing open, and propped on the safe's shelf where the tissue-wrapped blue had lain for 70 years, a single brass plant label, on which Cordelia had written, in her best copperplate, "You're 2 generations too late," she decided. They took the label evidence of their own burglary, which said something about their discipline collapsing, filled the pit with less care than they dug it, and were gone by 4. By 8, Cordelia's solicitors had the footage, the crime number, and a forensic team booked. By 10, the clip of the van's number plate had been traced by an investigator on Harewood Kaplan's retainer to a security subcontractor, whose largest client was the insurer of a certain forthcoming museum exhibition. And by noon, Cordelia was sitting on a bench on the embankment eating a sandwich she did not taste, understanding that the message on the label had done its work and changed the war. They now knew that she knew. They knew she had moved the contents, that she had funded lawyers, that she was not a distressed seller and never had been. What they still did not know, the one thing, the only thing, the thing worth everything, was what had been in the safe. Papers, stones, the stone that must not exist. Their nightmare had been a loose thread named Margit. Their nightmare now had no name, no shape, and a solicitor in Gray's Inn. Frightened institutions do one of 2 things, Nathan had said. They lock the doors, or they invite you in to find out what you want. On the 11th day, the invitation came, on paper so thick it barely folded, hand-delivered to Harewood Kaplan. Sir Denholm Vane requests the pleasure of the company of Dr. Cordelia Ashworth at a private view and dinner to mark the forthcoming exhibition, 200 Years of Light, the Garrard Room, Castellan and Vane, New Bond Street. Black tie. RSVP. Her solicitor advised against. Daniel Levinsky advised against. Nathan Levinsky, when she visited the hot little room above Greville Street with the card in her bag, read it twice, laid it on the bench where 60 years ago he had weighed her grandmother's stones, and said something else. He wants to look at you across a table and price you. It is how his kind read. Everything in that room will be arranged to make you feel small and new and lucky to be there. He looked up, and the fierce old eyes had gone somewhere very far back, 1951 perhaps, A Rotterdam dealer's face perhaps, and come home again. Go, let him price you wrong. Wear no jewelry, nothing, you understand, it will unsettle him more than diamonds, and when he shows you the blue, and he will show you the blue, he will not be able to help himself. Look at it the way your grandmother looked at everything. Slowly, like you are deciding. He pushed the invitation back across the bench. And Delia, first time he had used her name. Ask him about the weight. The garret room at Castellan and Vane was on the 3rd floor, above the shop but below the workshops, and it had been designed in 1887 to do to visitors exactly what it did to Cordelia when the lift doors opened. Silence them. Walnut paneling the color of brandy. A table laid for two with silver that predated the light bulb. And on every wall, in gilt frames with little brass lamps, the history, warrants, letters from palaces, photographs of queens leaning over velvet trays, 200 years of light, arranged so that whoever entered would understand at once that they were inside an institution, and that institutions do not lose. Sir Denholm Vane stood as she came in, and he was better in person than in photographs, which she had expected, because Gerald Locksley's and Denholm Vane's always were no. She caught the thought and corrected it. She had never met a Gerald Locksley, but some quality in the silver hair and the beautiful stillness of the man rang like a bell she already knew, some type that recurred in the world the way certain weeds recurred in disturbed ground, and she found the recognition steadying. Her grandmother had been right about soil. Underestimation was the best there was, and this whole room was built on it. Dr. Ashworth, his handshake was warm, dry, calibrated. I'm so glad. I half feared your lawyers would forbid it. They did. He laughed genuinely, she thought, filing it. He liked courage or liked consuming it. Then we're both here against advice. Mine begged me not to write to you at all. Lawyers would have us all live like submarines, please. He seated her himself, and for 40 minutes, over consommé and Dover sole and a Merceau older than her career, Sir Denholm Vane was enchanting, and never once mentioned a greenhouse. He talked about the exhibition, the loans coming in from 3 royal collections, the insurance men crawling over everything like Death Watch beetle. He talked about the flotation with a candor that was itself a performance. 200 years a family firm, and in November we belonged to pension funds. My great-great-grandfather would horsewhip me, but heritage, Dr. Ashworth, is capital, and capital must work. He asked about her orchids with what appeared to be real attention, and mourned the state of scientific funding, and said, gliding, somewhere in the pudding course, that he had heard she'd been shabbily treated. Everyone says so, and that it happened that the Vane Foundation endowed research fellowships, and that the trustees were always interested in botanical conservation, particularly work as distinguished as hers, and particularly, the glide came to rest as gently as a leaf, in candidates who understood discretion, whose energies were not scattered by, for instance, litigation, by old family papers, by the kind of inherited clutter that consumed promising lives. A fellowship, said Cordelia. 5 years, renewable, your own program, your own site. We own rather a lot of Kent as it happens. He smiled, and the little brass lamps shone on the warrants, and there it was, laid out on lace. Her career back, her orchids back, her life back, price marked in invisible ink. You'd be free of all this noise. That's very generous, she said, and let the pause grow until it had weight, until she could feel him reading her, pricing her, finding the number nearly settled. It's strange, though. That's the second remarkable offer I've had this spring from people I've never met. The first wanted a 99-year lease on a ruin. Yours wants, what would you say it wants, Sir Denholm? The temperature of his attention changed. Not the face, the attention. Peace, he said, for both our houses, and stood, brushing the crumb of the moment from the cloth. Come, before coffee. I promised myself the pleasure you of all guests should see her before the museum crowds do. The blue was downstairs in the night vault behind the shop, and he brought it out himself. No gloves, she noticed. Owners never wore gloves and set it on a black velvet pad under a single cold lamp that had been placed, like everything in that building, generations ago, by someone who understood theater. And Cordelia looked at the stone her great-great-grandfather had cut in 1908, the stone that had crossed the channel sewn into a coat over her grandmother's heart, the stone that had bought this room and those warrants and that man's beautiful stillness, and she gave it what Nathan had prescribed: silence, time. She looked at it slowly, like a woman deciding, and she felt rather than saw the effect on Vane, the small adjustment, because whatever her face was doing, it was not doing what visitors' faces did. 31.6 carats, he said at last, into her silence, selling to steady himself. Acquired from a continental estate in 1946, though of course a stone like this has deeper history, one feels it. What did she weigh before? The vault hummed. Somewhere above them, the shop alarm ticked through its evening cycle. I beg your pardon. Before 1946. Cordelia straightened up from the velvet and looked at him, level, her grandmother's eyes doing the work they had waited 80 years to do. Recut stones, remember, Sir Denholm. It's not mysticism, it's physics, old planes ghost under new facets. Strain doesn't forgive. A stone like this could be read like tree rings by anyone with the right equipment and the original measurements. She let original measurements stand in the cold lamp light between them for a full breath. I only ask because you said heritage is capital. It must matter enormously in November that the capital is sound, that nothing surfaces. I'd have thought the insurers would want to know what she weighed before, that's all. Thank you for showing me. She's beautiful. My family have always thought so. She had rehearsed the last 5 words with Nathan and against Daniel's protests, and delivered, they did precisely what the old man had promised. They took away Vane's ignorance without giving him certainty. My family have always thought so. An heirloom sentence, unfalsifiable, unactionable, unforgettable. She watched 200 years of breeding hold his face together while everything behind it recalculated, and then she said good night, and walked out through the shining shop under the warrants, and stood on Bond Street in the spring dark breathing like a swimmer, and texted one word to Daniel Levinsky, the agreed word for he knows we know, proceed. Merceau. The counterattack took 6 days and it did not come at her. That was Vane's answer to the vault, and it was clever and it was cruel, and for a fortnight it very nearly worked. He went at the acre through the will. Verity's solicitors, reinforced now by a probate silk whose usual clients were dynasties, lodged a claim to set aside Margit's final codicil entirely. Undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. The greenhouse clause, they argued, was itself the evidence, roots and all. She will understand when she is ready the ramblings of a fading mind, procured by a granddaughter who had visited with suspicious devotion in the final year, who stood to gain, and who had Exhibit 1, a documented history of professional dishonesty. The Thornfield smear, revived a 3rd time, doing at last the work it had been built for. And if the codicil fell, the acre fell into residue, and residue went to Verity, and Verity's fund-managing son had a buyer waiting, and every stone and paper Cordelia now held became, retroactively, taken property, evidence not of inheritance but of theft. They are not trying to win, the probate barrister told her in a Gray's Inn conference room papered with the claim. They are trying to make you spend a year and everything you have proving your grandmother's mind, and to hang, disputed, round the neck of anything you produce in October. It's a poisoning action. Effective ones usually are. Then we prove her mind, Cordelia said, in a way that ends it. And it was here, the fortnight she afterwards thought of as the bottom of the whole affair, the fortnight of lying awake itemizing everything the machine could take, that her grandmother reached out of the ground and won her own case. Because Cordelia, going back through the deed box for anything bearing on capacity, reread the file marked the ones who tried, and noticed what she had missed in the crypt. The 1968 journalist's clipping had a byline, and the byline had a name, and the name T. Fairwood appeared once more, decades later, on the very last paper in the folder. An envelope, sealed in Margit's hand, marked for Delia. If they say I was mad, open this first. She had thought it a metaphor. It was a filing instruction. Her grandmother had pre-read the enemy's pleadings 50 years in advance. Inside was a letter and a certificate. In 2019, aged 91, Margit Ashworth had presented herself, alone by taxi, to a consultant neuropsychiatrist in Harley Street, sat a full battery of cognitive assessments, scored in the 96th percentile for her age, and had the consultant execute a sworn statement of testamentary capacity, video recorded, witnessed, and lodged in triplicate. One with Mr. Okafor, one in the crypt, one. The letter noted with a dryness that made Cordelia laugh out loud through tears in the Gray's Inn conference room, with a journalist who owes me a story. T. Fairwood, who tried in 1968, and who has been waiting longer than you have been alive. Thomas Fairwood was 83, and he lived in a flat in Deal with a view of the Channel and 4 filing cabinets he had never let his children throw away, and when Cordelia telephoned, he listened to her say her grandmother's name and was silent so long she thought the line had dropped. Then he said, "I was 25 when they put stolen cufflinks in my car. I'm going to want to be there in October. Front row. That's my fee." He gave evidence by affidavit within the week. The 2019 recording, the pattern 1951, 1968, the long clean line of the House of Vane silencing questions about one blue stone, and he gave Hereward Kaplan his cabinets. And in the 4th cabinet, in a folder marked Antwerp 1972, was the last hidden layer, the one even Margit had never seen, the one Fairwood had found the year after his career was ended and had never had anywhere to publish. A deposition, taken by a Belgian restitution commission from a dying Antwerp diamond broker, describing how in the summer of 1940 the occupation authorities had been guided to the workshops of uncooperative cutters by lists. Lists provided through a Lisbon intermediary by an English house that wished certain accounts closed. And naming among the workshops so closed, with its master deported east in 1942, never to return, Eisler and Zonen. E. Castellan Vane had not merely kept the stones. He had sold the man. Cordelia read the deposition standing at Fairwood's window with the Channel light on the paper, and the old journalist watched her from his chair and said, quietly, "Your grandmother suspected. I'm sure she suspected. I could never prove the Lisbon link. The intermediary's records were destroyed. But put my cabinet beside her tin, girl, and the dates shake hands." He was right. They did. The last letter from Samuel Eisler in the biscuit tin, dated August 1941, hoping his brother partner in London would do what can be done through Lisbon. The payment, found within days by Hereward Kaplan's forensic accountant in Castellan and Vane's own archived ledgers, released on court order in the probate action Verity had so helpfully begun. A payment of £4,000, October 1941, to a Lisbon agent, coded in the books as settlement of Antwerp accounts. The probate claim collapsed on the Thursday. Confronted with the 2019 capacity file, Verity's Silk withdrew inside a morning, costs against. And Rupert rang that evening, voice entirely changed, no Delia now, to say that they'd been used, that Marchant's people had approached them first, that Mum never knew where the money, and Cordelia said, "I know, Rupert. You were the soft. Tell your lawyers to keep everything," and hung up, not in triumph, because there wasn't any to be had there, just a smaller machine broken inside a larger one, but with the last flank quiet at her back. And so it stood in the first week of October, with the museum banners already up along Exhibition Road, 200 Years of Light, and the Flotation Roadshow booked for November, and the machine on Bond Street gone eerily, totally silent. No letters, no offers, no burglars, the silence of a house that has priced its enemy at last and found the number frightening. In the hot little room above Greville Street, the plan was rehearsed a final time. The museum's own conservation department, approached formally by Hereward Kaplan, wholly independent, professionally thrilled, and institutionally terrified, had agreed, under the equalities of scholarship and the covering fire of a court order obtained ex parte on the strength of Samuel's workbooks, to permit non-invasive tomographic examination of the lone object known as the Castellan blue, on the morning of the exhibition's press preview, in situ, before witnesses. 2 independent gemological laboratories, a judge's appointed expert, Dr. Priya No. Cordelia caught herself again. Strange, these ghosts of stories she'd never lived. Daniel Levinsky would run the comparison against Samuel Eisler's 1908 maps with the Bourse's equipment. Thomas Fairwood would have his front row, and the press preview meant the whole of Fleet Street would be standing under the same roof when the machine read the stone's rings. "He'll come," Nathan said at the end, turning his cold tea. Vain, to the preview. His whole life is in that case with the lights on it. He will stand next to it and smile for the cameras with the scan running, because to stay away is to confess, and his kind cannot confess. And when the picture comes up on the screen, the old man looked at Cordelia and passed her, at 70 years of names. Rotterdam, 1951. Fairwood, 1968. Samuel on a list, 1940. Make sure the girl from Antwerp is the one standing where he can see her. "She will be," said Cordelia. "It's her exhibition. He just paid for the lighting." The morning of the press preview, London gave the museum the kind of light that photographers pray for and defendants should fear. High, clean, October blue, the kind that forgives nothing. Cordelia arrived at 8, 3 hours before the doors, through the loading entrance with the Levinsky equipment van, wearing the lanyard the court order had made unarguable. Dr. C. Ashworth, claimant's representative. She had dressed as her grandmother would have dressed for it, plainly in gray, no jewelry, nothing. It will unsettle him more than diamonds. And in her bag, beside the certified copies, she carried 2 objects that had no evidential value at all: a brass plant label and a photograph of a girl on a step in Antwerp, level-eyed, deciding. The exhibition hall was finished and empty, and it was magnificent, and she made herself walk at once alone before the lawyers came, because she wanted to see what 200 years of light looked like when the house that rented it still believed in itself. Cases of tiaras, letters from palaces under glass. A wall of photographs, coronations, state visits, the shop front through 2 centuries, and not one image, not one line of text in the whole shining nave, that admitted the existence of Antwerp, of workshops, of hands. Heritage is capital, Vane had said. It was more particular than that, she thought, standing before the final case. Heritage was capital with the labor filed off. And there, at the heart of the hall, on a black plinth in a case with its own guard and its own cold star of a lamp, the blue, 31.6 carats. Acquired from a continental estate, 1946. The placard was new. The museum, hedging under legal advice, had added one line that had reportedly cost a week of screaming between counsel. Aspects of this object's earlier provenance are the subject of ongoing scholarly examination. "Scholarly examination," said Daniel Levinsky, arriving at her shoulder with the first flight case. 86 years, 3 ruined lives, and a court order. Scholarly examination. He set the case down. "Papa's in the van. He wouldn't wait at home. He's brought his own loop. He says machines are for confirming what a Levinsky already knows." He hesitated. "He also brought a kippa for after. He says whatever happens, something will need saying over that stone, and none of these people will know the words." The scan had been negotiated down to the minute. 10:40. Object removed from case by museum conservators, 2 independent labs, and the judge's expert witnessing. Chain of custody unbroken on camera. 10:50. Tomographic acquisition, 40 minutes. 11:30. With the press preview open and Fleet Street inside. Results rendered, side by side with the certified 1908 maps of Samuel Eisler, on the Conservation Department screens in the hall, because Hereward Kaplan had fought for the venue of the reveal like a beachhead, and the museum's press office, scenting the story of the decade, had fought secretly and shamefully on their side. At 10:15, Sir Denholm Vane arrived. Nathan had promised he would come, and he came the way empires come to their last mornings, immaculately. Navy suit, the discreet pin of some order in the lapel, a phalanx of communications people and lawyers moving with him like pilot fish, and a smile prepared for every camera. He toured the hall as though he owned it. He had, after all, paid for the lighting, shook the museum director's hand for the photographers, and then, because his kind could not help it, because 200 years of never being contradicted had worn a groove in the man that steered him even now, he came across the floor to Cordelia, in front of everyone, hand out, voice pitched to Carrie. "Dr. Ashworth, I'm told this morning is your doing," cameras turning. "I want to say publicly, our house welcomes scrutiny. We have nothing to fear from science. A house is only as good as its history." "Yes," said Cordelia, and shook his hand and gave the cameras nothing, and him only the level look. "I've been saying the same thing all year." The stone came out of the case at 10:40 exactly. She had not predicted what that would do to her, the conservator's gloved hand lifting the Vrouw van Antwerpen into open air. The first time in her life she had seen it out of glass and off velvet, in daylight, the blue of it suddenly not cold at all but the exact color of the February sky over a Channel boat in 1940. And she stood very still with her ration of shaking, spent by 9 a.m. And her grandmother's voice in her ear, "Composure, Delia. The wheel signs its work, let it speak." Nathan Levinsky in his chair at the front where Thomas Fairwood sat beside him, the two of them 96 and 83, side by side like the last witnesses of a drowned country, leaned forward as the stone passed and said something to it softly that Cordelia was near enough this time to hear, and it was not Yiddish, it was Flemish, and it was, "Not long now, old lady." The acquisition ran, the hall filled. Journalists, curators, insurers, the flotations bankers in a nervous knot by the tiaras, the museum director rehearsing neutrality, Vane at the center of the room performing serenity so well that Cordelia felt an unwilling flicker of something, not sympathy. Recognition of craftsmanship, perhaps, one maker to another. He had spent a lifetime cutting and polishing himself. At 11:28 the conservation screens went live to a hush that started at the front and fell backwards through the crowd like a wave. Daniel Levinsky's voice, amplified, was as dry as an auditor's, and every sentence was a nail. The left screen, the certified 1908 register of Samuel Eisler, master cleaver, Antwerp, the measured map of a stone called the Vrouw van Antwerpen, 33.4 carats, with its tracings, its facet junctions, its recorded internal features. 2 growth structure planes, 1 point of strain from the original cleaving, positions noted to tolerances a modern laser would respect. The right screen, the tomographic render acquired 40 minutes ago of the lone object known as the Castellan blue. The examination identifies, beneath the present cut, ghost planes of an earlier facet arrangement, said Daniel, and the overlay came up, the old geometry rising through the new like a face rising through water, which correspond to the 1908 register within measurement error. The internal growth structure corresponds. The cleaving strain corresponds position, orientation, extent. In the opinion of both independent laboratories and of the court's appointed expert, whose statements are being distributed now, the object in this exhibition is the stone documented in 1908 as the Vrouw van Antwerpen, recut with a mass loss of approximately 1.8 carats. At some point after its documented receipt, the 1940 paper filled both screens now, the confident English hand held to order, E. Castellan Vane, into the custody of this house. The silence in the hall had a texture Cordelia would remember all her life. 400 professional noticers, all noticing at once, and the sound of a 200-year-old story dying was no sound at all, just the soft percussion of every phone in the room beginning to type. Vane stood beside the empty case, and to his credit, it was the only credit left, and she gave it to him. He did not bluster. He turned to his lawyers, and his lawyers were looking at the floor, and in that instant Cordelia watched him understand publicly at the center of the temple he had built, the thing her grandmother had staked 80 years on, that there was no one left to sue. Not a Rotterdam dealer alone in a foreign trade. Not a boy journalist who could be handed cufflinks. The evidence was physics, the witnesses were institutions, the venue was his own gala, and the cameras, he had invited the cameras. He had ensured the truth for £60 million and hung his flotation on its provenance, and the truth had simply waited, underground, deciding, until he built the perfect room in which to be told. He found her in the crowd. Of course he did. And Cordelia stood where Nathan had told her to stand, beside the front row, one hand on the old man's chair, in Vane's direct line of sight, and she did not smile, because there was nothing to smile about, 86 years of it. She only held up so that he alone could see it, small and dull among all that glitter, a brass plant label. He could not possibly have read it at that distance. He did not need to. She watched the last calculation cross his face, the recognition that the acre, the smear, the burglars, the fellowship, the dinner, every move his machine had made since February, had been anticipated by a vegetable-growing widow in Kent who had died before he made the first one. And then his communications director was at his elbow, and the pilot fish closed around him, and Sir Denholm Vane left his own bicentenary through a service corridor, past the crated tiaras. And the photograph of that exit ran on 11 front pages the next morning under variations of a single word. The unraveling took months, and Cordelia attended almost none of it, because machines, once broken publicly, are dismantled by other machines. The flotation was pulled within 48 hours. The warrants were suspended pending review, a phrase that had never before appeared in the house's history. The burglary footage, the Penrose Blake report, the leaked termination letter, the Lisbon Ledger entry, each found its proper procedural destination, and the conspiracy charges, when they came in the spring, named Sir Denholm, his head of security, and to the particular satisfaction of a suspended director now cooperating with investigators, the chairman of the Thornfield Botanical Institute's funding committee, who turned out to sit on the Vane Foundation's board. Cordelia's data was formally re-examined by an independent panel and pronounced, in the driest scientific prose, exemplary, and Thornfield's public apology mattered to her exactly as much as her grandmother would have predicted, which was one evening's quiet satisfaction, and then compost. The Lisbon file went to the Belgian Restitution Commission, and that was the one proceeding she did attend, in a plain room in Brussels a year later, where a researcher confirmed what Fairwood's cabinet and Samuel's last letter had said to each other across 50 years, and the name Eisler was entered into a different kind of register, the kind that does not value, only records. Samuel Eisler, master cleaver, denounced 1940, deported 1942, murdered at a place whose name the commission read aloud while everyone stood. There was no justice available for that, and Cordelia did not insult her great-grandfather by pretending the courts of 2027 could supply any. There was only the record, set straight, and a granddaughter of his granddaughter standing up in a plain room when his name was spoken. Some debts are not collected. They are answered. The stone came home in the autumn by court-approved settlement. The wreck of Castellan and Vane had insurers, and the insurers had actuaries, and the actuaries knew a lost cause, and the question everyone asked, in the profiles and the documentary and the 3 podcasts, was what Dr. Ashworth would do with a 31-carat blue diamond worth more than any building she had ever worked in. Sell it, said the sensible. Keep it, said the romantic. Cordelia did the thing the level-eyed girl had raised her to do. She gave it a job. The Vrouw van Antwerpen went on permanent loan to the museum that had, at the end, chosen scholarship over sponsorship, displayed not among tiaras, but in a small room of its own, beside Samuel's workbooks. The 1940 receipt, the enemy alien card, the photograph of the shop with the gold letters, and a video screen where a woman of 91, recorded in Harley Street in 2019, looks into the camera at the end of her capacity assessment and says, unprompted, in her unsoftened accent, "You will ask one day if I knew what I was doing." Write down. She knew exactly. The insurance income from the loan, substantial, permanent, endows the Eisler Ashworth Trust, and the trust owns a walled acre in Kent, where a great Victorian greenhouse, restored pane by pane over 2 years by a woman who documented every stage as though reviewers were watching, now propagates Cypripedium calceolus for reintroduction across the English limestone. The colony in the south border was left exactly as planted. It flowers every May, 41 plants in their strange, deliberate rows, and the interpretive sign does not translate them. Visitors are told only that the founder wrote something here, in a slow alphabet for one particular reader, and that it was received. Nathan Levinsky lived to see the stone rehung. He came to the opening in his chair, in his kippah, with Daniel and Fairwood beside him, and said the words over it that none of those people knew, and afterwards he held Cordelia's hand in both of his spotted translucent ones, and delivered his verdict on the whole 86 years, with the only sentence she ever saw defeat him halfway through. "Your grandmother, Delia, your grandmother was the finest," and then he waved his own tears off like flies and finished, ferociously, "the finest cutter I ever knew. She just worked in years instead of stones." He died that winter in the hot little room above Greville Street at his bench. Daniel found a note in the vault, addressed to her in the old man's hand, and it said, "The wheel is yours now. It still turns true. Things that are made honestly outlast the people who steal them. This is not a proverb, girl. It is a professional observation." Cordelia works in the greenhouse most days. The iron door under the vine border stands open now. The room below is climate-controlled archive storage, and school groups are shown the jeweler's bench and the belt-driven wheel, oiled, turning true. But she kept one thing back from the museum and the trust and the interpretive signs, one thing that lives where it always lived, in the dark, deciding. In the old Chubb safe, on the shelf where a blue stone waited 70 years, sits a biscuit tin, and in the tin is a 9-page letter that begins "My Delia," and beside it a brass plant label, and Cordelia goes down alone every February in the season of Channel crossings, and reads the 9th page by lamplight. The page with the sentence she has come to understand was never about orchids at all. It hides for years underground and everyone says it is dead. It is not dead, it is deciding. People too, she would tell you, the underestimated, the dismissed, the quietly capable, the ones the confident walk past pushing trolleys and pulling weeds. The world prices them at £900, at £9 in the pavement, at too convenient to be credible, and the world is wrong, and being wrong costs it nothing until the day it costs everything. Patience is not waiting. Patience is work done where the confident don't look. Value is not in the warrant over the door. It is in the hands at the bench, the truth in the grain, the record kept, the wheel that signs its work, and the truth, if it is made honestly and buried deep, does not rot. It waits. It decides. And it always, always flowers.